Coercive Capital is proudly supported by Hummingbird. Hummingbird is a modern compliance platform designed to make financial crime investigations smarter, faster, and more effective. Because today's financial criminals are sophisticated, savvy, and agile, meaning the tools used to fight them should be too. Learn more at hummingbird.co. Welcome to Coercive Capital. I'm Elaine Dezenski. I'm excited to be launching this podcast on the Illicit Edge Network. For over 2 decades, I've led major initiatives in national security, anti-corruption, and risk management at the Department of Homeland Security, the World Economic Forum, and now at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And with every episode, my goal is to provide you with fresh ideas on the most pressing economic and national security challenges of our time. We face a complicated set of security threats, but we have many opportunities to address them. Radical transparency in finance, trade, and investment, and strengthening key economic alliances and partnerships must be cornerstones of our national security agenda. I'll speak with leading experts in the field, those that have helped guide and shape this country's thinking on national and economic security, and those who fight the good fight to keep America safe from foreign adversaries. One such expert is Juan Zarate, the former Deputy National Security Advisor and author of Treasury's War, a book that documents the evolution of the U.S. Department of Treasury's role in economic warfare in the wake of 9/11. In our wide ranging conversation, Juan and I discussed today's economic security landscape, our complex relationship with China, ally shoring, and the growing weaponization of trade. Without further ado, let's get into it with Juan Zarate. I know a lot of folks are familiar with your background and all the amazing work that you've done as Deputy National Security Advisor for combating terrorism at the White House under the George W. Bush administration. Prior to that, serving as the Assistant Secretary for Terrorist Financing. I think you were the first person to have that job after 9/11. And since leaving government, you've been an entrepreneur. You formed the Financial Integrity Network. Hard to believe it was more than 10 years ago. Of course, that's now part of the K2 Integrity family. You've also served as an academic, teaching for 8 years at Harvard Law School, and have many affiliations, including the one that's closest to my heart, which is serving as co-founder and chair of the Center on Economic and Financial Power at FDD, where I'm running the center as senior director. So wonderful to have you here. And
thanks, Elaine. By the way, that makes me feel very old. All that stuff feels long ago,
well, me
especially
too.
the government service. And I got a lot of gray and less hair. But anyway,
Well,
great to be
right
here.
there with you. Yeah, but it's all good. And it is, I think, helpful for this conversation that we can go back 20 years. Hard to believe it's been 20 years, but since that time when we were both serving in the government after 9/11, you were at Treasury, I was at Homeland, and you were charting some new pathways with respect to how the government was thinking about and continues to think about dealing with non-state actors, asymmetric threats, the rise of authoritarianism. Now we're in a slightly different moment here, this post-COVID moment, I might call it. But I thought maybe it would be helpful for our readers to root this conversation in the post 9/11 environment. So what we were facing really a generation ago in terms of rethinking how to use economic and financial tools to push back against a new class of foreign adversaries. And uh, starting there makes some sense because what we're facing now and the toolkit that we have now is largely based on a lot of that investment. But we're also in a moment where we need to move into a new phase of how we think about protecting our systems. So maybe we can just kick it off with kind of the basics around how you think about this convergence of economic security and national security. What are we facing today in terms of exposure, particularly exposure of our economic and financial system to rising authoritarian threats? How should we think about that convergence?
Yeah, Elaine, and I'm so happy you have this podcast for precisely these issues and themes because I think the question of our national economic security is now in many ways taking pride of place as we talk about where geopolitically and geoeconomically the United States sits and the challenges we face with China and Russia, shifting alliances, the expansion of BRICS, et cetera. But I appreciate you recognizing that, a lot of the fundamentals of what we're facing and how the U.S. government is dealing with those sets of challenges in the economic and financial domain were set in that post 9/11 period. And I think it bears mentioning some of the fundamental shifts that happened right after 9/11 that really does set the stage then for where we are now. And I think most people tend to think of 9/11 through the lens of that tragic day, the horrors of terrorism, the challenges of al-Qaeda, and that's right. But one of the things we did at the Treasury Department, largely due to the urging of the president, was to think more aggressively about how we used U.S. economic and financial might, and I would even say suasion, the ability to influence, to not just punish al-Qaeda, but to isolate them from the financial system and to find ways of dismantling terrorist networks, dismantling their financial infrastructure, and ultimately to not allow terrorist groups like al-Qaeda and others that have global ambitions to use the financial system and capital and the elements of the commercial system to our disadvantage, to attack the United States. And so the question was, how do you do that? And in many ways, the U.S. has asymmetric power. We are the largest economy in the world, the most attractive capital markets. The dollar is the chief reserve currency, the chief trade currency around the world. What the U.S. says and does in the economic domain usually matters in the international system, the rules of the road. And so we then set out a strategy to use that system, that power, to isolate not just al-Qaeda, but other rogue actors. And ultimately, it became sort of the mantra and the strategy in the Treasury Department that we want to make it harder, costlier, and riskier for America's enemies to raise and move money around the world. That was what we were doing. And we wanted to do that in a way that was systemic, that was global, and that leveraged U.S. power in this domain. What we recognized, Elaine, was this was going to be a domain of conflict, right? A domain of influence and power that was fundamental to national security. And you could already begin to see that the financial rogues, those that were being excluded from the system, were beginning to align, whether it was terrorist groups, criminal actors, rogue states like North Korea. They were going to try to evade sanctions, evade controls, use the system to their advantage. And we've continued to see that over time, such that what we're facing now, in particular with the rise of China and the state authoritarian capitalist model, is in essence a challenge of systems, and where not only the U.S. Is potentially vulnerable, its financial system, commercial system, cyber attacks, the kinetics of threats, a lot of which you worked on, but also the systemic threats, which is to say, do you have a group of economies? Do you have a system, Chinese commerce, payment rails, new crypto payment ecosystems that begin to rise in a way that not only evade U.S. sanctions and Western scrutiny, but start to alter the standards by which international finance and commerce operate, so that things like transparency, traceability, accountability may not matter as much. Things like corruption may be more de rigueur in the international system, and where, in fact, these other actors are able to gain access to capital, goods, technology in a way that harms U.S. national security. So we're at a place now where everyone is recognizing that economic security is now fundamental to national security. And that creates all sorts of challenges, which we can talk about. But that's where we are now. The post 9/11 period in many ways set the stage for it. We are now right in the heart of an economic and commercial struggle with some of America's adversaries and rivals.
I think it's a perfect framing for getting into some of the questions we're facing today. And you've alluded to China, and I want to go down that pathway a little bit more because one thing that seems very clear is that the integration of our economy, our US economy, with China, which for probably 2 decades was seen as, such a strength, has now, taken on a different, lens. And some of this is certainly a response to the situation during COVID, where it was clear that our supply chain resilience wasn't what it needed to be. We couldn't get PPE into the country. We were worried about, critical materials and supplies, and we continue to be worried about that. But it's a fundamentally different conversation than, for example, how we were thinking about the Russia threat in 2014 or the threat of Al Qaeda in the early 2000s, because we're in a different position. We have influence as massive consumers of Chinese product, and that's something we should pull on a little bit more, maybe a little bit later. But it means that the way we apply sanctions, export controls, the tools of economic warfare are probably a little bit different, and we may need new tools. So maybe we could dig into that a little bit more, because really China is now driving so much of this conversation around economic security and how we build that level of resilience, but also use the power that we have in the marketplace in different ways. But it's from a consumer perspective. It's not as the primary trading partner for most countries in the world. So these dynamics have shifted, and this brings up some interesting challenges for us.
Yeah, no, there's a lot in that question, Elaine. There's no question that the perception of China and the economic relationship has shifted, right? The old paradigm was we need to engage with China. We need to get China into the international system, the World Trade Organization, into FATF, into all of the organs and systems, in part to help them develop economically, but also to open them up and also to create the entanglement that would create elements of not just better relationships, but also dependencies, which would create deterrent effects and the rest. And so that was the paradigm for much of the last 30 years with respect to China. And it frankly has led to massive Chinese growth, massive investment in China, massive development of their manufacturing base, even their technologies. Huge advantage to China, but a recognition now that we've moved to a different stage, in part because of Chinese behavior, much more aggressive in the international domain, much clearer, frankly, as to what their ambitions are in terms of centralized Communist Party control over the economy, over technology, over all the elements of the national economy, to the point where they've cracked down on their tech giants and their tech moguls. They've consolidated tech R&D, for example, in the quantum space. So we're seeing a very different China internally and externally as they've grown more aggressive in the South China Sea elsewhere. But it bears mentioning in light of 9/11 and where we've been on sanctions, because in many ways, the sanctions that have been applied post 9/11 were applied in ways that were easier to apply if we were talking about isolating actors from the international financial commercial system. Because you were talking about actors like Al Qaeda, or maybe even Hezbollah, or North Korea, or moving up the chain, Iran, which was important to the oil sector, but not much else. And now Russia, which is a major G20 economy with lots of oil and lots of mineral wealth. And now the question of China. And so you've moved up the scale of targets, so to speak, or of actors that have been the subject of sanctions and should be isolated, but incredibly difficult to do with China. And so now the narrative with China is, how do we think about decoupling? That's now moved to the narrative. How do we de-risk? Meaning, how do you unwind in ways that don't have us so fundamentally dependent on Chinese supplies, supply chain, manufacturing? How do we unwind so that we're not transferring our most exquisite technology? And how do we begin to restrict those things that China says that they need and want for the advancement of not just their economy, but for their military. And they want that, and they say it explicitly, in order to challenge the United States, to push us out of the region, and in many ways to reestablish a new system along with its allies, including Russia. And so we are now faced with a major global economy, the number 2 economy in the world, one that's has ambitions to be a technology giant, but also has military and geopolitical ambitions that in many ways are antithetical to our interests. And so the question is, how then do you constrain the Chinese economy without strangling it? And how do you continue to have relations with a major economy like China that we still rely on without giving them unfair advantage in trade, in technology, and in capital?
Yeah. Yeah. So the concept of ally shoring, or as the Biden administration has termed it, friend shoring, is a really interesting part of this. And picking up on your point about decoupling or de risking, this idea of strategic decoupling across, as you say, the most exquisite technologies, the most valuable of our advanced manufacturing opportunities, the areas where the jobs will be produced in the future, bringing that back. Either to our shores or working with democratic allies and partners seems like it has to be part of this solution, because we're talking about a misalignment of rules and core values, or at least that's my kind of my take on it, that is driving this division in the marketplace. And maybe we need to be honest that it was always there, but the fact that it's now weaponized. At least I think we would view it that way in terms of how we've seen the Chinese Communist Party utilize its market dominance, right, in ways that don't necessarily recognize the U.S. as a primary consumer of their goods and as an integrated trading partner. Um, there are a lot of threads here that are kind of working at cross purposes, but at the end of the day, it seems like creating a space where aligned partners, and I'm talking about democratically aligned governments, have an opportunity to reinforce and rebuild the trust around an open rules-based system, that would be really important. And maybe we're at this point of a very serious rewiring of our economic and financial and trade systems as a result. It's also interesting that at this point, the Chinese economy is under some serious strain, uh, for the most part, because they haven't been able to implement steady reforms around their own systems, and they're facing some serious headwinds, demographic headwinds, slow growth internally, this lack of a consumer market to pick up a lot of the demand, right? So there's this focus on export driven growth, but it's becoming harder and harder for them to manage that. So this is also where, as a major consumer of Chinese product, the US and Europe as well, I think there's a real opportunity to align the fundamentals around how we manage this and bring a little bit of balance back into the relationship. But easier said than done.
Yeah, and I think we can get into the weakness of the Chinese economy and system a bit more, because I think there are those who are now saying, look, you are seeing the decline of the Chinese economy in a way that is happening in a faster way and in a more fundamental way than most had anticipated. So I think China isn't a 10-foot giant, and I think all the indicators, whether it's foreign direct investment, all the challenges on supply chain, consumer demand internally, the real estate market, the difficulties they're having across the board on debt at the local level, all of the fundamentals within China are creaky or cracking. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. This is not a 10-foot giant, and they're not poised to be the number one economy in the world. The U.S. still is. This still is the American century. if the U.S. Handles this properly and continues to grow and to handle its fundamentals right. But given your question, I want to take a step back because for the listeners, I think they may wonder, like, well, we're talking about a lot of different things. We're talking about supply chains. We're talking about sanctions, et cetera. I think one way of thinking about, what we're talking about, and frankly, Elaine, I think a lot of the topics you're going to cover in your podcast series over time is kind of the spectrum of arenas, if you will, in the financial and economic domain that are now subject to this conflict and competition, largely with China, driven by China, but not just China. It's Russia, it's Iran, it's other actors. And it's the full spectrum of things that you may not have ever considered as part of national security. There are things like sanctions that have always sort of been in the national security orbit. The things like the anti-money laundering system, which requires the banks and authorities to know who and what is moving money in through the system, so to speak, right? There's the anti-corruption system, which, from a U.S. perspective, tries to discipline the markets so that it's not corroded by corruption and other externalities that are not only deteriorating a society or a system, but making things unfair in the marketplace. Then there are things like export controls, which have taken on even more importance in the Russia context and in China, because we are trying to restrict, for example, high-end semiconductors so that we can maintain an advantage in that space and in the military context. And so export controls now have an important role. You now have investment security, both inbound and outbound. That is to say, restrictions on who can own what in the U.S. That's through the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. That is that's been in existence since the 70s, but has taken on a more dominant role in protecting the U.S. system, because we don't want the Russians or the Chinese or the Venezuelan generals or the Iranians hiding their hand to own sensitive technologies or properties, for example, next to military facilities. And so there's more restriction there. Restriction on the outbound, both in Congress and from the White House, restrictions on how U.S. capital, this is private investment, can invest or what it can't invest in particular in China. Things like semiconductors, lasers, quantum computing, AI, and then trade, and then supply chains. And so there's an entire spectrum of activities and authorities that are now implicated by everything you're mentioning, Elaine. And with China, it's the hardest problem, right? Because you have the entanglement of the economies. You have a major economy that has its own weight and gravity unto itself. And so the question is, how do you use some of these measures, if not all of them, to constrain what we consider to be Chinese behavior that's dangerous or threatening? And that means everything from suppression of the Uyghurs in Western China and use of slave labor in the cotton fields to suppression of human rights in Hong Kong, to threatening our allies, the Philippines and Japan, in the maritime context, or more broadly, their attempts to be the dominant player in the most exquisite technologies in the world for purposes of their military. So that then sets a table for, we shouldn't have deep dependencies on China. We should find other ways of creating resilience in our supply chains. To your point, we need to find more creative ways of creating networks and alliances that benefit those that want to trade and work with us and may not necessarily want to trade or work with China, or may want to but have to find an alternative. And we've seen that in the Middle East and other places. And frankly, how do we find other ways in the context of what's happening with deglobalization to take advantage of reshoring and ally shoring? And Elaine, there's been nobody better than you doing work on this. So for the listeners interested in this idea of ally shoring or friend shoring, I would look to Elaine Dezenski's scholarship on this first and foremost. But the idea here is essential because we have to think differently about alliances, and alliances not just in a military context like NATO, but in the context of economic, financial, and technology networks and investment and alliances that we need to reinforce not just the US economy, not just to counter bad behavior, but also to drive, as you said, the norms and the rules of the road so that the rules aren't being defined by the Chinese and the Russians. They're being defined by those actors that want a transparent, traceable, accountable system.
This is such a multi-layered, complex domain, and you've done an amazing job over the last few minutes making the connection points across the threats, the tool set, the challenges of working within this integrated global economy. Maybe we can pick up a little bit on this question of how we define an economic alliance, because this also raises some interesting questions. You know, when we talk about an ally, and this was actually something that came up when I started writing about ally shoring 4 or 5 years ago, together with John Austin at the University of Michigan, now at the Eisenhower Institute. We were really thinking about this, application of the concept of ally, and we thought about, well, maybe we should call ally shoring something else. Maybe using the term ally is just too loaded in this context. We know what that means in the military defense space. We know what a NATO ally is, for example. We know what a Five Eye ally is. We have five of them. There are five in the group, and there is such an alignment around the not only the way that threats are perceived, but also the way that systems become integrated and information sharing becomes core to a group of military allies. In the economic space, some interesting questions arise. For example, do we consider Mexico to be an economic ally? I would make a strong pitch that we do. Now, does that mean that all the rules and norms align? Some do, most do, and we have a free trade agreement that reinforces it, but not always. We have to make a distinction between what an alliance looks like in an economic realm versus what a partnership or even a friend. I'm not a huge fan of that term friend shoring because I think friend means something different. Friends maybe come and go. I don't know. Allies don't. Uh, but this is a question, and maybe we need to come up with that very succinct Uh, definition of what economic ally really means. But then again, maybe it just depends. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, the use of the term friend reminds me of the old saying: "If you want a friend in Washington, get a dog." I think if you want a friend in international relationships, find an ally. I don't know, but in any event, I think you're right, and there are several layers to this because there's a fundamental question about, in the first instance, what do we mean by an American company, right? Because there are so many multinational dimensions to a global enterprise, one based in the US, but may have lots of subsidiaries and entanglements internationally, vice versa with international companies that have a huge US presence from a manufacturing perspective. Not to mention, then you're talking about investments and capital from all sorts of places. So the first question is often very hard, which is, okay, what do we mean by an American company? Some of that's easy to define, sometimes not. Then there's a question of, how should we be thinking about engaging in the world on these issues? I'll give you an example of this where the U.S. ran into trouble in part because it didn't have an American company or technology or champion, and that was in the 5G context, where during the Trump administration, they rightly, I think, and I think we were late as a U.S. government on this, started to raise concerns around Huawei and Huawei embedding into the telecommunications infrastructure all around the world, including in key allies, including in the UK, potentially, including in Mexico. And the question then was, what do you do about it? In part because Huawei is offering a service, is offering a technology, a capability, often cheaper than anything else in the marketplace. And the question then was, okay, if you try to rip and replace Huawei, what do you replace it with? And Elaine, the answer was not an American company. It was Ericsson and other options, Nokia or other things. That I think was an important lesson for U.S. policymakers, which is if we're going to engage in the international economic, financial, and technological sort of domain, we're going to have to think differently about what an ally means and, frankly, what our interests mean in this context. And that, therefore, in my mind, means we've got to think differently about our allies, because we're not going to do everything you need to do in a global economy in the United States, right? We're going to have mining of rare earth minerals in Chile, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in parts of Central Asia. We're going to need refinement of whether it's oil or lithium or copper in different parts of the world. We're going to need shipping lanes and transport that is assured and goes through allied territory and can't be choked off by enemies in different parts of the world. And so we're not going to be able to do that all through American companies, U.S. government investment, or American control in a classic sense. But you can begin to do that with allies who have capabilities, interests, and or maybe even more geographically well situated to do these kinds of things, especially when you're talking about logistics and supply chain. So I think you're spot on that we need to think very differently about what allies mean. And in the North American context, Canada and Mexico, I think that's not only an incredibly powerful set of economies and trade relationship, but we need to think of that as a whole. And this is why you've seen tension around, well, let's make sure the Chinese aren't trying to do an end around to some of our laws and restrictions by basically rebranding Chinese manufactured goods through Mexico or through Canada or playing other games with marking and labeling of their products. So I think it's very important. And frankly, this debate is happening, and you see it in the marketplace with manufacturing moving to other places other than China. Certainly new investment, and including old investment, moving to places like Vietnam, India, even Mexico, and a lot of countries, not just the United States, but Europe now coming to grips with the fact that it's overly dependent on China, and it doesn't want to be.
Winston Strawn is an international law firm that for more than 170 years has served as a trusted advisor and advocate for clients across virtually every industry. Winston Strawn's law practice, made up of more than 950 attorneys across 15 global offices, is built on the talent, creativity, and determination of its lawyers and an unwavering commitment to its clients. Winston Strawn boasts an exceptional financial crimes compliance practice comprised of attorneys who have decades of experience assisting clients with Bank Secrecy Act and anti-money laundering compliance counseling, state and federal enforcement matters, and related investigations. Learn more about the firm's capabilities at winston.com. Hummingbird is a compliance platform that's reimagining what's possible from financial crime investigations. Teams using Hummingbird work more efficiently and effectively without compromising on quality. Investigators quickly get to the heart of each case with information at their fingertips and compliance-grade automation and AI to boost productivity. Designed for essential work in anti-money laundering, anti-fraud, customer due diligence, and more, Hummingbird allows you to customize the platform to your policies, giving you exactly what you need to get the job done. Hummingbird is determined to fight financial crime by empowering those on the front lines, because financial crime never stops evolving, and neither should the tools you use to stop it. Learn more at hummingbird.co. That's hummingbird.co. A few words about one of our sponsors, the Crypto Council for Innovation. The Crypto Council for Innovation is shaping global crypto policy and working with leaders in the US, EU, UK, and Asia. It collaborates directly with security professionals, law enforcement, and government leaders to keep them ahead of the rapidly changing crypto landscape. The tailored workshops and learning programs provide national security personnel with the latest insights and what's coming next, helping them build connections with industry experts and fellow officials. Head to cryptoforinnovation.org to get in touch and join the next workshop. In this segment, we delve deeper into the Chinese economic model, protecting U.S. strategic supply chains, and the alignment of private capital. Getting back to this core question about allies and partners, maybe starting small or starting with a couple of cases where we can build on the framework we already have in place through free trade agreements, through alignment, and then build that out over time, but recognizing that it's also a long-term play.
Yeah, I think you're right, Elaine. And the challenge here is in the global free trade system, that paradigm, U.S. companies, for the most part, have not cared much about elements of the supply chain, where they got, the component parts or the minerals, or as long as it was efficient and it met their needs, it didn't really matter. What the Chinese have done with their model, their economic model, and you see this in the EV context, is really to create the efficiencies around not just production of the cars or even batteries, but the aligning the entire supply chain so that what they have done successfully is to, from sort of tooth to tail, from point of origin of the material all the way to production and sale, the Chinese are in control of it, or at least have strings and levers that they can pull. In some ways, that's a very different model. At the initial stage, it may be inefficient, but at the end of the day, it may allow them to control costs and access to supplies in ways that Western companies aren't aligned to do. Western companies are dependent on suppliers and others that they may not own or control. And so that's one fundamental difference that's fascinating, which then underscores your point, which is if Europe or if the United States wants a competitive EV market or solar panel market, or pick your technology, how is it thinking about its supply chain and the origins of the goods that it needs? The military is certainly doing this now, and you've seen this in legislation and in DoD reviews, where they're having to look very carefully at their supply chain. Whereas, again, in the past 30 years, they didn't really have to worry so much about it. They would get their titanium from Russia. Is it so clear that we can get titanium from Russia in the future? I'm not sure. If we need rare earth minerals, 96% of which come from China, are we going to get access to those that we need for our batteries or our military equipment or high-tech implements? Maybe not, right? And so we're having to inspect, for the high-end national security reasons, but also for our economy, what are the supply chains that matter, and how should we think about those networks that then are fundamental to the ability to produce and the ability to compete. And to your point, Elaine, it then becomes really important to think about how we leverage allies, how we leverage comparative advantage in the marketplace with our friends, with our allies, in a way that allows us to not have to do everything, to not have to have U.S. capital investing in everything, but to have at least the ability to have access to the things that we need and the supply chains. And again, it's not everything everywhere in the world, but those things that we think are strategic and that are necessary to kind of the future of the economy and the future of sectors that we think are important, we then need to start unpacking where are the materials coming from, where are they refined, how are they transported, who owns and controls that chain of events, the supply chain, and how do we get in the middle of it? And frankly, private capital is starting to move in this direction with a bit of help from the U.S. government. But you see this, for example, in the private investment in Subic Bay in the Philippines, where the U.S. had, in essence, been kicked out sort of welcome back, but there was a question of how the investment in Subic Bay would follow, whether or not Chinese investment would come in or something else. You had American private investors come in and invest in Subic Bay in order to take that strategic port in many ways and put it onto our side of the ledger. So those are the kinds of things that I think are starting to happen. But it's not happening at scale, and certainly it's your scholarship and those of others that are starting to illuminate where we need to do this more fundamentally.
So the question of capital alignment is such an important topic, and I want to dig into that a little bit more. Subic Bay is an excellent example, and certainly there are more opportunities where we can think about asymmetric investments to break a chokehold within a supply chain. So going back to some of the EV research that we're going to soon publish, one of the key issues is the question of price volatility around critical minerals, and how when you have a dominant position in terms of extracting critical minerals, or even more importantly, processing those minerals, like China does, it gives that government incredible market power to set prices in a way that keep competitors out. We fundamentally can't compete against a state subsidized model. Uh, and then that pricing dominance becomes even more problematic over the long term as prices start to rise because there are no competitors, no alternative sources, particularly for processing. So, yeah, we definitely have to get a handle on this and think about where we can provide incentives, where we can push back, whether that's through tariffs, other types of controls, to allow for a new ecosystem to come into play. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult for us. But on the other hand, uh, dismantling this full vertical integration of these industries that China has built up may not be necessary if we can go at it in a more strategic way and kind of break off those points of the supply chain where that risk becomes really problematic for the U.S. or for the U.S. and its allies. So every supply chain looks different. I think that's part of the challenge, and it becomes a monumental task. But the upside to all of this is if we can identify more clearly where the risk is, it also provides a bit of a roadmap to private capital, right? To be able to invest in those areas where there's huge opportunity, not only to create a new ecosystem, but ultimately over time to drive some real investment and profit. And so this kind of raises the question, right? How do we use these tools in a way that supports the kind of open market rules-based system we want, but without becoming so heavy on industrial policy that we end up with something like the Chinese system, where there's a tremendous amount of subsidy, but also a private sector that really doesn't exist as we think of the private sector, or you know, certainly not as it used to.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a fundamental challenge of the 21st century for the United States and our system. That is to say, how do we align private sector interests, private capital, uh, private technology innovators in a way that does not have the U.S. government co-opting, owning, or controlling those interests. And you do not want the U.S. system to become a state authoritarian system. You don't want an aggressive industrial policy where the government is picking all of the winners and its champions. But it's hard because I think all of us applauded and heralded the CHIPS Act, which is the U.S. government's sort of investment in the semiconductor industry, in particular to reinforce manufacturing in the United States. Much, if not all of that investment, it seems to be going to Intel, and in many ways, Intel has become the U.S. semiconductor champion, right? And this starts to then look like the French system, the Japanese system, where you have industrial policy that really is driven through one or two state champions per industry or sector. So I think we don't want to kill the golden, the goose that laid the golden egg here, the golden goose in terms of the U.S. system, the innovation that comes from it. by then imposing the U.S. government in different ways. On the other hand, the U.S. government can be incredibly helpful in spotlighting where there are needs for particular capabilities, if not capital. This is why what was then called OPIC is now the Development Finance Corps was expanded to try to, in essence, expand U.S. Government insurance around particular investments around the world. It's why Exim Bank was reauthorized in a fairly aggressive way with focus on China, work that you have done, Ambassador Dobriansky's done, and others really effectively. It's why DoD has established capabilities and funding on the tech side. So I think the U.S. government is trying to figure out how to align private sector interests without crossing the line. And that's a gray area. That's not an easy answer. And it's one that's subject to a lot of debate, especially when you start getting to industrial policy, or you get to these kinds of sectors or capabilities like mining of rare earth minerals that is really expensive, hard to do, rife with other regulatory issues like environmental issues, for example, in Nevada or the West. And so how do you align all of that to get the access or the capabilities that you need? That's not easy. And this takes a lot of, I think, grappling in a different way with our national economic security. And I think, again, we don't have to think of this alone. And I think this is a bit of a challenge with some of the legislation that very much wants U.S.-based manufacturing, U.S. origin goods. At a certain point, we have to think about how we let our allies into that system, and there are allowances for that, but also how we think about that internationally, because it may be that the most efficient access to rare earth minerals isn't in Nevada. Maybe it might be in Australia, or it may be in some part of Europe where we can get access efficiently, but we may not have to do it necessarily in the U.S.
So I want to bring in a couple of cases that I thought would be interesting to highlight some of the challenges that we've been talking about, and how we're thinking about applying tools like sanctions, for example, and when the rollback of those tools might actually serve a greater purpose. So picking up on the critical minerals thematic and some of the conversations underway around Dan Gertler, who's a heavily sanctioned individual, an Israeli involved in critical minerals for many, many years, sanctioned in 2017, along with many others, for a lot of corrupt practices in the DRC. And now there's some discussion about potentially lifting those sanctions in exchange for Gertler agreeing to sell off his royalty streams from some of these mining operations. What do you think about that? And this idea that, not only do we need to think about implementing these tools like sanctions, but where there's strategic opportunity to roll them back because we've achieved something even more valuable in the process of levying these sanctions.
Elaine, I'm glad you raised this case because it's fascinating. I think it raises three different elements that are relevant to our discussion, really important. One is it raises this question of how do you unwind sanctions in a way that is strategically advantageous to the United States. And this is something I've been writing about, we've been talking about for a long time, which is we often think about sanctions in a fairly static way. It's an on-off switch. You're either imposing a sanction or not. And when you do it, you kind of move on to the next sanction. As opposed to sanctions as a continuum of influence. And the way I've described kind of the financial and economic landscape, especially with sanctions, is it's about shaping the environment. It's about shaping the risk environment in which market actors are playing. And that isn't just about one action. It's about a series of actions, including unwinding at the right moment with the right conditions in a way that advantages U.S. interests. And so that's an important question. How do you unwind in a way that that meets our interests and doesn't do damage to what we were trying to do initially. Two, it emphasizes the fact that the anti-corruption sort of agenda, which you've been a part of for as long as I've known you, Elaine, is really a fundamental part of this national economic security environment, right? This isn't just about how do you apply the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or the Anti-Bribery Act from the UK. This is about strategically how are sanctions, anti-kleptocracy measures, law enforcement tools, how are those being applied in a way that strategically matter? That's why the Global Magnitsky Act was passed to look at human rights and corruption. Actors around the world have been applied globally. It's why Dan Gertler's sanctioned. And so this case raises the question of how do you deal with sanctioned actors that are sanctioned because they're corrupt, and they're not being prosecuted for it, right? Sanctions aren't prosecutions. And so what do you do? In part because they have ongoing operations. And so there is a fundamental question about, especially in these corruption sanctions, what comes next? There has to be reform. There has to be cleanup. There has to be remediation. And so we've been doing a lot of this work at K2 Integrity to say, okay, let's think about monitorships. Let's think about cleaning things up in a way that gives the U.S. government comfort, but doesn't necessarily kill enterprises that may actually be important. And the third layer of this, which is really what you're getting at, which is this now puts these kinds of sanctions and the question of access to rare earth minerals right in the same conversation, right along that spectrum that we were talking about earlier. And that's really important because we can't think about sanctions in isolation. You can't think about access to rare earth minerals in isolation. You can't think about trade controls, export controls. These are all related. And this particular case, based on what we know publicly, shows that the State Department and the Treasury Department are grappling with a very important question, which is how do we ensure access to these very important mines and minerals when those mines are owned by somebody who's been sanctioned, and where we still want to drive the idea of anti-corruption and transparency. So what does that look like? How do you unwind the sanctions? How do you ensure proper access to the mines? How do you ensure that corruption doesn't follow in whatever happens? So I think that's all at play, and it demonstrates again that we're in a different geoeconomic, geostrategic environment when we're talking about these issues. 20 years ago, you would have just talked about whether or not somebody was going to be delisted. You wouldn't be talking about the strategic impact of what that delisting means.
Right. And there's something very powerful about the idea that we have strategies to roll back sanctions, for example, where it makes sense, when there is something much more valuable that we can drive for market dynamics for countries like the DRC. Where they desperately want to increase local value around these critical industries and how they develop over time, and ultimately using this concept of transparency, or like we often refer to it radical transparency, and all of these tools, sanctions, export controls, contribute in some way to that notion of radical transparency that then begins to flip the idea that we're not just protecting ourselves by using these tools and by driving an anti-corruption framework. We're actually using it as a sword, not just the shield, but the sword. It becomes a strategic way to change the dynamics of the market, to drive that concept of the level playing field in a way that we've talked about, but we haven't really gotten there. And so, again, taking a step back and looking at how capital alignment plays into this, looking at how we use these tools for purposes that are actually much broader than just sanctioning bad behavior of Dan Gertler, as important as that is. So, so it's really interesting to see how all of this develops.
I just want to comment on this because it's a really important point you just made. And for listeners who follow this space and who followed Illicit Edge, they know that, one of the things that's happened over the last 20 years, with sanctions and with the anti-money laundering rules sort of broadening and deepening, greater sensitivity to corruption, you've had a broad de-risking around the world, sometimes blunt, sometimes for a variety of reasons. But the reality is, you've often seen U.S. institutions, Western institutions, and even capital retreating from environments like the DRC, like parts of Africa, parts of South Asia, Central Asia, et cetera, Latin America, because of concerns around financial crime, sanctions, risks. And I think a major challenge in this space is, how do you create those avenues of greater transparency? How do you create mechanisms of greater assurance so that capital is not coward in this regard? Capital is encouraged to race into those environments. And part of that is, the U.S. government in some ways helping or shining a light on those opportunities. Some of it is courageous capital playing a part, but some of this has to do with actually shaping environments that are transparent and accountable and that provide that level of assurance. So a lot of the work that we're doing at K2 Integrity is a part of the mission of my great partner, known to many of the listeners, Chip Ponce, who's been attacking this problem to say, let's build systems and capabilities that make the system more transparent so that you have more opportunities for capital to flow into what are considered to be higher risk environments or deep, dark environments where, frankly, we need that capital. We need the presence in order to compete with China, in order to compete with Russia, in order to get access to goods and services that are important to the global economy.
Yeah, and I'm glad you came back to that question about reform within global financial systems and the work that you and Shiv and others have done through Financial Integrity Network, and now K2I has been nothing short of phenomenal. I run into it all the time, talking to people in the field who are using your training and working with you and the team on building better systems. And this is so critical. And maybe just to go into that point a little bit more, because we have a huge Illicit Edge subscriber base from the banking and finance community. This role of financial institutions and really being at the front line, deputized really since 9/11 to be the gatekeepers of a system that continues to have some gaps and loopholes, but is also much strengthened, is going to continue to be really important. And how we drive technology and compliance and better solutions for managing lots of data, all of that is going to be absolutely critical. But fundamentally, having alignment between the public sector and the private sector around these goals of financial reform, that is the backbone. Because without that, I think this whole process that we're talking about of trying to bring the level playing field and trying to build that integrity within the system and trying to bring radical transparency, it kind of falls apart. So we really have to get back to those basics at the same time that we're thinking about, okay, what are these emerging threats, and what's the toolkit, and how do we balance that out, and where can we bring in strategic investment and align that with sanctions and export controls in a way that helps build, what we're talking about, this systemic approach. So yeah, this is going to keep us busy for a long time.
Yeah, no, Elaine, and you said a lot there, and I really appreciate what you said about our work. I'm, privileged to work with a lot of former Treasury colleagues and others in our company. So I really appreciate you saying that. It goes back to what we were talking about with respect to what happened post 9/11, because post 9/11, it wasn't just that the Treasury became important to national security and that we were thinking about more aggressive use of U.S. financial power. That's essentially what was happening. But we also reconsidered, along with industry, how we thought about financial integrity, right? And the point here is that the measures we took with respect to sanctions, the Patriot Act and Title III, the expansion of the anti-money laundering system, everything we were doing in the FATF to expand requirements ultimately around effective systems to deal with anti-money laundering and financial crime, all of that had to do with the strength, the integrity, the soundness of the financial system itself, which meant that the key elements of that system, mainly the large global banks as well as other financial institutions, had to now start fundamentally worrying about these issues of financial integrity as a fundamental part of their business and as a part of banking. This wasn't just some regulatory requirement or some diplomatic sanction. This is now a part of banking that is just as fundamental as managing for credit risk, right? Managing for financial crime risk. And especially now, given our discussion, what you see in the industry, and you see it with authorities, is the convergence of not just risk, but these regimes. That is to say, sanctions, anti-money laundering, anti-corruption, anti-fraud, cyber controls, insider threat. These are all now, in many ways, interrelated. And you're now having more pressure on investment advisors, given the new FinCEN rule. So now you have investment security, all of which a major financial institution has to worry about. And ultimately, what they have to worry about is the risk to their institution, to their customer base, to their data, that they are potentially being misused by rogue actors, criminals, state, non-state actors in this system. And that was the major shift post 9/11, which is to say, there's a responsibility here for you in terms of not just complying with the law, but thinking about this as a fundamental part of your culture of compliance and the way you do business. And banks complain all the time. Believe me, we've got lots of bank clients, and there's a ton of pressure put on them. And regulators have to, I think, modulate that in terms of asking for what's effective and not just sort of checking the box, so to speak. But the demands are real because the risk is real. And it's a risk not just to national security, but to the fundamentals of the financial system. And if we want a transparent financial system, you need financial institutions, namely the large, dollar clearing banks in particular, to have systems in place, controls in place, a culture of compliance in place that actually allows them to know who they're doing business with, how money's flowing through, and ensuring that they're not facilitating, malign actors from accessing capital through their institutions.
Maybe as a final thought, I know we're coming to the end of our time here. I'd love to maybe get one idea from you as we move into a new administration next year, 2025. Lots of challenges, but also lots of opportunities. In the space of economic statecraft, what do you think might be the most important aspect for a new administration to be thinking about going forward?
I'll give you two ideas, if it's okay, Elaine. I think the first, and we've lurched toward this, I think, in the two prior administrations, but the idea of thinking about a national economic security strategy writ large, and having the White House lead an effort to not only align all of the agencies and authorities around this theme, but beginning to grapple in particular with Congress and the private sector on what the bounds of that looks like. Right? These questions of how far do we go with our industrial policy? When we're talking about exquisite technologies, are we going to have champions or not in different technologies, whether it's AI, robotics, quantum, et cetera? How do we think about the use of the authorities, and how do we make sure that we're using these authorities in concert for U.S. interests, and we're not sort of sclerotically applying these things in silos, which has typically been the case. So having a very clear strategic outlook and then driving the U.S. government to force this debate and discussion, which is upon us, right? We can't avoid it. The second is, and it would be a part of it, I think, is to think about this question that you've been so articulate on, which is how do we think about alliances differently in this context? Because we're going to have layers of alliances at the end of the day. We're going to have those that are really within the inner circle in the tent. We're going to have those that we're willing to sort of be very close partners with on supply chain and other things. Then there are those that we're going to want to trade with, but may not want to let in the tent. And then there are going to be those that we want to exclude. And those alliances are really important in the context of a shifting global restructuring of alliances, the expansion of BRICS, the establishment of the Quad, the attempt by China to reorder systems. All of that's happening in the backdrop. We then need to think aggressively about how we drive alliances in the economic and financial domains.
Drawing from 3 decades of leadership in the national security arena, Juan Zarate, Chief Strategy Officer and co-managing partner at K2 Integrity, shared some fantastic insights on today's economic and national security challenges. My thanks to Juan for helping to set the stage for a wide range of conversations to follow. I'm Elaine Dezenski. This is Coercive Capital on the Illicit Edge Network.